because I think that evil knows that the moment that we start to catch on to this notion of beauty and goodness in the world, it's going to double down on its effort. Because beauty is anathema to evil. And the fact that we start to pay attention to it and see that this is what God isn't just wanting to make, but wanting us to become, evil will know its days are numbered.
Hello and welcome to The Naked Gospel, where we have conversations about sex, singleness, marriage, pornography, and everything in between. We bring on cultural thinkers, parents, important folk, and normal folk alike. I am your host, Shane O'Neill. If you're listening in, video versions of all of these episodes are available at YouTube, Proven Ministries. We have that below. If you're watching, you just rather listen in, then all of these episodes are available on every major podcast platform. Whether you're listening or watching, do subscribe and continue to track with us. Thank you for tuning in and enjoy the episode. Hey folks, thank you for joining here at The Naked Gospel. As always, if you'd like to support the show and what we do, check out the Disruptor Initiative. It's in a link down below. We have somebody who is a supporter of this show who's vowed to match any supporter for till the end of the year. So if you give $5, it becomes 10. If you give $10, it becomes 20. Basic math. But you get a cool mug, you get other sweet things, and you get to shape this podcast. You get to suggest who comes on and the themes we look at. So do check that out. Today we are joined again by Dr. Curt Thompson. He joined in January to talk about his book, The Soul of Shame. So Curt has kind of systematically been going after misconceptions that we have in the Christian faith. Anatomy of the Soul was the first book that he wrote. There's this idea in kind of broad stream Christianity that truth is abstract, and if I can believe it and hold on to it, then I can follow Jesus. And he wrote this book to help us see that spiritual formation involves our bodies, and that we are embodied, that we're embodied souls, but also ensouled bodies, that there's a kind of link there, that we are, well, he takes us through this word, integration. And what does it look like to live an integrated life instead of compartmentalized life where we feel different emotions or different reactions? But what does it look like to be a whole human being? That's that book in a nutshell. And then he wrote The Soul of Shame. Golly, it still wrecks me. I read it twice at the time. And so there in Genesis, naked and unashamed, Adam and Eve, naked and unashamed. That's how they're described. All of a sudden they sin and they're ashamed and they cover up. Jesus didn't die with a loincloth on. He was naked. They were trying to humiliate him. And then it says that he scorned that shame, right? For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame. And so Curt's trying to help us to see the place of shame in the Christian life and the shame of the Messiah and the freedom therein. Really remarkable work. And then this last book, it just came out. It's called The Soul of Desire. See, even right there, you probably get a hint of the misconception that we have of Christianity is that, as Christians, that following Jesus is just about propositional truth, statements of faith, creeds, whatever. And a lot of times we think that following Jesus means that I have to count the cost, that I have to give up my desires to know Jesus. But what does it mean that we're made in his image, that we think thoughts after him and maybe even feel thoughts after him? That's what we're going to be talking to Curt about today. I'm really looking forward to it. Curt, thank you for joining us and being here with us.
Shane, I just have fond memories of our last conversation in January, and such a pleasure to be back and looking forward to our time today.
I'm curious. So these are kind of standalone books. You can read them without that order whatsoever. But did you have that progression in mind from the beginning?
It's a good question. I can honestly say I didn't have any of this in mind from the beginning in some respects. I think the first book I wrote was an attempt to put into a book form a lot of the things that we were trying to provide for our patients. And how can we do this in a way that would be helpful for them? And I didn't, interest, was obviously generated in quarters, that I wasn't expecting it to be generated in. And I think that in the process of writing that first book, even before that first book was done, though, one of the things that really started to emerge was this issue about shame, kind of seeing like, why is it so hard for us to move toward integration? And what are some of the main features of the world and of our lives that create disintegration?
Yeah.
And then this third book, and so the shame book kind of clearly emerged from the first book. And this third book, in and of itself, quite frankly, the last 5 years have been kind of a bit of a hard slog in even coming up with an idea and where is all this coming from. But I would say that much like the work of the Spirit, and much like I think the way we say that, we see our life coming at us through the windshield, but we only understand our life through the rearview mirror. Even as I'm writing this third book, I wasn't necessarily thinking, this is in many respects is kind of a trilogy. There is a 3-part sense of this.
Sure.
So I wasn't really thinking that in advance, but in hindsight, we would look at that and say it would make sense that somebody could imagine that that's in fact what was happening. For my part, I would say I see that as the work of the Spirit in the way that the Spirit does so many things. I mean, I'm sure that the people of Israel, when they were in the desert after coming out of Egypt, are not thinking, hey, someday this is going to make a great book that we're all going to call Deuteronomy. Like, love all the quail and the manna.
Yeah.
What a great story. Like, no, we're not thinking that. We're thinking like, I'm just trying to get through my freaking day.
Yeah.
And I would say as well, though, that in some respects, there were, acorns of the beginnings of both the second and the third book in the first book, and likewise of the third book in the second book, and so forth. And I do think that, as I would describe it now, my experience is that the third book is an even fuller, more robust response to the questions of shame that were raised in that book, in The Soul of Shame. And because in the way that we talk about in The Soul of Shame, we talk about this need for a cloud of witnesses in order to bear witness to our lives, in order for shame to have no place to hide, so that we can be liberated and loved. It wasn't until I began to write this next book that I thought, oh my goodness, like, yes, began to love, and to what end? And this notion that we were then, that the end is beauty, because this is what we were not just made to do. We weren't just made to make this. We were made to become this. And this is shocking to our senses. Like the notion that someone would look at us, we walk, into the office one day and say, Shane, my gosh, like you're just utterly beautiful. And of course, to hear those words from anybody, it would be weird and like, and what do you want? And what are you trying to manipulate me for? And all the things, or how are you trying to use me or consume me or whatever, especially if you're a female, all the things. But there is a sense in which, as we might talk about here today, there's a sense in which, to bear God's image, to live like he lives, is then to live like he was living in Genesis 1, where he not only says, and God saw that it was good, but this interchangeable word of the Hebrew, and God saw that it was beautiful.
Amen.
And that he's in the business of creating beauty.
Amen.
And it is beauty, as von Balthasar would say, he's in the business of that. It is beauty that is the thing that draws us to goodness in the first place. It's beauty that awakens my mind to what ultimately is true. Because it's my senses that first have to sense the world before I can make sense of it. And but anyway, that's maybe getting ahead of the game here.
No, that's perfect. I do want to hear you talk about the reality of desire in the Christian life. So I know passages like "Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart." A lot of people, myself included, have read that passage as saying, if you delight yourself in the Lord, then the things he give you, you'll end up liking.
Hmm.
But nothing of that is necessarily intrinsic. It's kind of like foisted upon, or at least our minds
Right.
can go there pretty quick.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I did bring up in the introduction, kind of counting the cost, denying yourself, pick up your cross, follow Jesus. There's a lot of maybe obedience language seems overt, but then so does desire and beauty, but it's less translatable. And so I was just curious how you understand beauty playing out in the Christian life.
Well, I think I would begin this with this again. I tell folks there's really nothing that you can't. I mean, there's very little that we can't learn about human beings by reading the first 10 chapters of Genesis. It's pretty much all there. Beginning, and this notion that I just mentioned, that even in the very act of creation, the act of God looking at something he doesn't just look at day 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and acknowledge that it's beautiful. I've made this thing, I've named this thing, I've given this thing purpose, and that's a beautiful thing. There is a sense in which the very act of God looking upon it is what brings the beauty forth. And the writer of Genesis is just a brilliant writer. He's a brilliant writer. This notion that he doesn't explain God, he shows us God. He doesn't tell us who God is. He's not just saying, well, God is this and God is that, like Genesis chapter 1. It doesn't come out of it's not a chapter about God in terms of his like explicit character. It shows us what he does. And this is a God who loves us into beauty. And I want to suggest that even my brokenness, my own trauma, my own sin, my own shame is part of how it is that I end up feeling those verses that you mentioned, feeling them foisted upon me. Because even when you get to the Shema, when you get to Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one, and then you head into the 10 Commandments, to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul. What we often, I hear that and I think, okay, God comes into the room and he just presents me with this document and says, here's your job.
Believe this.
Love, right. Believe this, love me, do these things, don't do these things. This is your job.
Yeah.
As if that's where it begins.
Yeah.
But that's not where the text begins. The text actually has this litany of things about, I'm the God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. I'm the God who has loved you with an everlasting love. Like all these things in which the preamble to the document of the 10 Commandments, the Decalogue, the preamble is, you're just so dang beautiful. The preamble is I can't believe I get to be your God. The preamble is like what parents feel when the baby comes into the world. I'm so glad you're here. You walk into the room, Shane, it's you. We've been waiting all day for you. This is what we read in Mark 10 when Jesus is having his encounter with the rich young ruler. And only in Mark's gospel do we read the text that says, and Jesus looked at him and loved him. And then said, there's one thing that you lack. And the thing that you lack actually is not something that you're not doing. It's something that you are doing. Like you're working so hard to earn my affection for you that I need you to go stop doing that and then come and just be with me and receive what I have to give to you. And he missed the look. And the Hebrews missed the look. And instead, they only saw the document. They only saw the list of the things that we have to do. And of course, this is my story. And so beauty then isn't a thing that I first experience as something that is me that's coming into the world, whereby which then I can, because I'm this loved, I can be this anxiety-free and shame-free to notice beauty, even in the smallest of places, that my desire to be with you, to notice you, to in order to create beauty, I don't do that. But it doesn't mean, instead, I end up consuming beauty. I end up hoarding beauty. I end up doing all kinds of things to like grab it and hold it and clutch it, because in the same way that our first mother took from the fruit, I'm going to take from the world. I can't just receive it as it comes to me. And so my brokenness, my desire, I don't, my desire, there's a certain list of things that I'm allowed to desire. I'm allowed to desire, Oreo cookies, but only 2. I'm allowed to desire coffee, but only 1 cup. I'm allowed to desire sex, but only in these, all the categories that we have, as opposed to, and so it is a thing that I know that is true about me, but I have to be careful about it. And because if not, like it just becomes a function of devouring. Right? There's a very fine line between desire and devour, as opposed to if we pause and we just say, first of all, if we think of desire primarily as this, tiger in the cage that I have to contain, and say, wait a minute, in the first place, desire is who we are right out of the uterus. Babies come into the world, like just developmentally, we are a wanting people. We just want. And then we discover that once we get beyond the wanting of an object, I want the mother's breast milk. I want to be, I want to be comforted. I want these things from the outside. But then I discover as I age, I want to be seen by you. I want to be known by you. The challenge, of course, is this whole process is tangled up with all my shame. And so because it's really messy and muddied and all the things and so forth and so on. And so even sex becomes this tangled mess and web of all kinds of things that are really painful and difficult and so forth. But it doesn't stop the fact that my longing and my desire is to be seen, soothed, safe, and secure. We talk about in this book, these 4 S's: seen, soothed, safe, and secure, in order for me then to go on and to make things. Because the next thing that we see that a child wants to do, long before we get to the Bible, the next thing that we see developmentally that a child wants to do, once they're seen by you, and once they get to somewhere between the ages of about 2 and 3, maybe 4, they start to make stuff. And they don't just make stuff, they bring it to you, and they want you to put it on your refrigerator, and they want you to charge the neighbors money to come and see it. Because this is an object of great joy and beauty. And when we celebrate, oh my gosh, this is such a beautiful piece of whatever it is, they're utterly delighted. And so this material thing now becomes another conduit for a deeper way of being known. And the deeper way of being known sends the child right back to their room to get more crayons and more paper, and they make more stuff. And the next thing you know, they're creating math algorithms, right? When they're in graduate school. All the kinds of things that we are called to create, such that beauty itself only strengthens and reinforces our longing and desire to be known and more deeply connected. And so there is this ever ascending, ever deep, in the language of C.S. Lewis, it's a further up and further into progression of connection and beauty and connection and beauty and connection and beauty, that everything just becomes ever more and more and more intense. I don't get this line. I mean, like when St. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, when he says, so we do not lose heart, even though our outer nature is wasting away, our inner nature is being renewed day by day. I'm thinking like, wait a minute. When the car comes off like the line, it's new, and then it just gets old. How is it that I'm more new on Tuesday than I was on Monday, and more new on Wednesday? Like, this is like a time travel thing that only God gets. And so this sense that we become ever increasingly more beautiful ourselves as we enter into this connection with others. And it all begins with the degree to which I myself have had a felt, viscerally encountered, embodied sense of being God's delight. And to the degree that I don't have that, shame will still want to take up residence. Because I think that evil knows that the moment that we start to catch on to this notion of beauty and goodness in the world, it's going to double down on its effort. Because beauty is anathema to evil. And the fact that we start to pay attention to it and see that this is what God isn't just wanting to make, but wanting us to become, evil will know its days are numbered.
I want to peer into that a little bit better. I think that listeners at this point might start to understand that what you're saying is intuitively true. I think we have intuition for it because we are all wrestling with being captivated by pixels. That there is we're realizing that we're creatures who seek stimulus and novelty. These things are becoming more aware to us. But we also wrestle with that because we want to know human connection. We want to know authentic beauty, and pixelized relationships or one-sided pixelized interactions. So you brought up earlier, like pornography, those sorts of things where we see a desire pushing us in a particular direction, and that direction is totally awful. And so our impulse then is to jettison the entire impulse, the entire desire, and try and recalibrate somehow. But we can't, we can't just crush our desire like that. And so we go back to porn over and over again, or whatever it might be, using YouTube to fall asleep, whatever.
Right.
It was like a week or two ago, I was struggling to sleep. And so I put on an audiobook. And I'm not saying that's necessarily bad, but there have been times in my life where I've done that every night. So what do we do? What do we do? How do we pursue beauty, knowing that our attention is the most valuable thing because it's absolutely non-refundable, right? What do we do when we're looking at our desires? It's pushing us in certain directions, and we don't know how to find a home for our desire.
So I think, at the end of the last several chapters of the book explore the fourth verse of the 27th Psalm. And what I invite the reader to consider is that this is a verse that is a response to our trauma and to our shame and to our hungering and thirsting, our desires teetering over the edge of devouring, that this provides a response to that. And notice, I don't say answer. I don't believe that, it's not looking that have the definitive word on this, but I think it provides a response. And the first thing that we notice is that the writer, and if you read the entire Psalm, if you read the entire 27th Psalm, this verse sticks out like it doesn't fit easily into. If you read verse 3 and then go to verse 5, everything flows pretty easily. But in the middle of this is verse 4 that kind of like, wait a minute, where'd that come from? Where he says, oh, but wait, there's one thing. For all that precedes in the first 3 verses and all that follows after it, there's one thing on which it's the fulcrum, on which everything is really, really being balanced, that I would seek after all the days of my life. This one thing have I asked, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, that I may gaze upon his beauty, and that I may inquire in his temple. And I think, Shane, that one response to the question, what do we do about this issue of desire, is it's helpful for us to ask the question, well, what is it that we want? What do we really want? And, for many of us who are, in our kind of earliest phases of recovery, that would be the phase in which I'm in recovery, but I'm not really aware that I am yet. I might not even be interested in it yet, but I'm there. I just don't know. It's kind of like Jesus is coming for me. I'm just not aware that he's getting closer and closer. The reality is that if we start by saying, well, what is it that we want? And we answer that and we say, well, I want the Tesla, or I want, or I want the girl on this website, or whatever it is that I want, then we just keep asking. And so what is it about that you want? Well, finally, somebody's going to be honest and say, well, I want to feel good. I want to. And how long is that going to last? And what is it that and we will discover if a person is willing to do the work. I mean, this is Jesus in the parables, right? I mean, these parables, he would toss these parables out, and they would be intriguing and confusing and so forth and so on. And he's basically then giving people the opportunity to come after him if they want to. But he has no intention of spoon feeding people. And so if they come after him, and he'll explain the parable to them, those who really want it. And so if you really want to answer the question, what do you want? You're going to be willing to go beyond the answer of, I want the Tesla. I want the second home. Whatever it is that I want, I'm going to get to the point where I'm actually able to say, I really want joy. I want to be seen, soothed, safe, secure. But I don't know how to get that. And this is where we would say it's really important for us to recognize that there are certain rules of engagement in the world that are non-negotiable. For instance, gravity. If you want to build a building, there are certain things that you're going to have to contend with as far as gravity is concerned, and it's not going to negotiate with you. You're going to build an airplane and fly it, like gravity is going to be in play, and you're going to have to pay attention to it. And in the same way, if we want to be seen, soothed, safe, and secure, there are certain fundamental interpersonal neurobiological realities, gravitational pulls, if you will, that will be necessary if you want that kind of joy. It's not going to come with a Tesla. It's not going to come with porn. Sorry, you don't get it. You don't get to get it that way. And this is where community plays its role. So when the psalmist says, I want to dwell in the house of the Lord, and as we explore in the book, the house of the Lord is actually, it's not just a building, it's a community. We are God's house, the progression over the course of the scriptures. We are God's house, but we are not just God's house that we come to on Sunday mornings, to dwell, we don't, in this culture, we don't, it's hard for us to imagine dwelling. Why would I dwell in a church? I only go there on Sunday mornings to be there for an hour, maybe 90 minutes. All the things you say, no, this is about dwelling. This is about remaining. This is about planting your gardens, being in the kitchen, being with people, being with a community by whom I can then gaze upon, and I can gaze upon and be gazed upon. And that's going to take time. We, I talk about this encounter that I had with the work of Mark Rothko, this American painter, this abstractionist. And, our listeners might be familiar with him. He's famous for these large canvases, what look like 3 bands of color. And you come to find out, if you sit with a painting long enough, that there's far more going on than just 3 bands of color. But you can't discover that if you're not willing to sit with a painting for probably a good 30 minutes at the very least. But we're prone to, we come into the Rothko gallery, the Rothko room at the National Gallery, and people are kind of coming in and out in 5 or 7 minutes. And that's like coming in and out of a room of a person, right? Coming in I'm going to somehow dwell with you by being with you for 5 minutes. But for us to dwell with each other and to allow ourselves to gaze upon each other, we discover that desire to be seen, if we give each other enough time to do this, that what will be seen and what we will see are the parts of us, not only that we find to be attractive, but the parts of us, of course, that we hate the most. And this is the beauty of the gospel, that Jesus comes to, the incarnation, Emmanuel. He pitched his tent with us. He's with us in your prayer. This notion that God chooses with his breath to, you prayed that. I'm like, dang. If our listeners just pause and consider that the creator of the oak tree outside my window is living in me. But I have to pause long enough to do that. And the parts of me that I hate the most are the parts that he's dwelling right up with, like you said in your prayer. Like, you don't just come and like, you're not just like, God's not just living in the rooms of our house that are neat and tidy. He's in every single room waiting for us to come and be with him in those rooms. And the way that I do that is to allow you to see me. And in fact, I've been so good at keeping that room locked, I've forgotten that it's even in my house. Until something comes up between you and me and you say, Curt, what's with the like constant qualification of your, like, why, what's that little comment that you keep making? What's that about? I'm like, what are you talking about? And you inquire of me, you gaze and you inquire. And when you inquire, more of my story becomes known to me that I can't know unless you are helping me tell it. And out of this, I discovered, gosh, I've actually been burning a ton of energy keeping that room locked, keeping that shame at bay. Until shame comes along and says, no, like, dude, I want to be in the room with you. I'm like, you don't want to go in that room. You're like, no, let's go in the room. And because you're with me when we go in the room is less frightening. And once we've been in the room and we look at the room and the room begins to have light drawn into it because you have asked the question, I don't have to burn the same energy keeping it locked. And that energy that I've been burning, that capital that I've been spending, containing my shame, is now available to me for God and you and me together to create the next artifact of beauty that heretofore I couldn't create because I didn't have access to the energy that God was waiting to use.
Excuse me. I want to sit and dwell. Thanks, Curt. Curt, as you're speaking, I'm thinking about I see people orient their lives in different ways. Some people are very driven by achievement or a desire to order the things around them, to order and fix the world. Other people, like myself, have strong dissociative tendencies. But either way, it seems like people are generally struggling with their story and their character. And I do want to, like, there is a difference. Like I've been able to distinguish times where I'm like, I'm walking really okay in my identity, but I'm really struggling with how to assimilate the story around me, how to be the character that God says I am amidst the story. But then there are other times where I really like how life is going. I like the story, but I struggle with the character. And so, I mean, when I personally look at how much time we spend on YouTube and porn and Amazon and Netflix watching things, and in books and fantasy books, I can't help but come away with the conclusion that we're all struggling to like our story and the characters in our story, particularly our own character, our own first-person character. One of the things that when I was getting off porn years ago, my counselor had me. We have the Blue Ridge Parkway is pretty close to us, and so I'd go up in the mountains once a day. I'd just drive up there, I'd hang out for half an hour, and I'd come back down. But I was supposed to just go up there and look at beauty. This is an exercise he'd given other people before. He gave it to me, kind of prescribed it. So I'd go up there, I'd stare at pretty things, it was in the fall, for half an hour, and then I'd come back down. And I did that over a series of months, of months. But that helped to recalibrate my desires. And so when it comes to the practical, like you mentioned the picture and taking 30 minutes or living an actual relationship with somebody else. But a lot of that, as we mentioned earlier, like requires so much darn bravery, like so much bravery to say this hurt me even. Yeah. To say like, what did you mean when you said that without being aggressive about it? Right. To actually stop, because if I stop and look at something or look at myself, then I have to acknowledge that I don't know what to do with my story, and that can freak me out. So some of the, I suppose part of the question, the bigger question is like, what do you long to see? Like, what do you long to see amongst Christians when it comes to how to inhabit a life that uses beauty and acknowledged desire as cultivating aspects of God's discipleship in our life?
One of the things Shane and I talk about in the book is this notion that we can't become things that we can't imagine. And one of the things that trauma and shame do is that they shatter our imaginative capacities. So it's not just that when I have and I tell people it's the difference between having a bruised wrist and having a bruised brain. If I bruise my wrist, my brain is still quite capable of assessing the bruise on the wrist quite accurately, and so I can tend to it because the organ that's doing the assessment of the bruise itself is still quite fine. But when the brain itself is bruised, not only is there an injury, but the very thing that I depend upon to help me like perceive the nature of the injury is also in trouble. And so the nature of how I understand the injury, what I was supposed to do with the injury, all those kinds of things, my capacity to imagine what my next steps would be is truncated. It atrophies. And so I can't very easily on my own imagine a next step. And so I need an outside brain to help me begin to imagine. And of course, that imagination process, that growth in imagination is a very, very slow process because especially, I was just reading in Luke's gospel, the last 2 days I've been sitting, I've been sitting with this story of, it's Luke 8, and I think it's 7 and 8. It's the story in Mark's gospel, it's in Mark chapter 6, the story of the woman who was hemorrhaging. And Jesus and the disciples come back across the lake after having this encounter with the demoniac and the Gadarenes. They get off the boat, and people immediately come to him and say, hey, there's the village priest, his daughter is dying. Will you come? And so he comes and the crowd is pressing around. And then this woman, the story is told of a woman. And of course, this is in retrospect, right? We know the story. And so we're telling this, but in the moment, what we read is that the woman thinks to herself, if only I can touch the hem of his garment, I'll be healed. And the text in Luke reads that she touches his hem and the bleeding stops. And you'd think that that's all that's necessary. You'd think that that's all that's necessary. Her imagination stops with, I just have to get the bleeding stopped. She doesn't yet imagine that the king wants far more from her than she even wanted from the king. And he stops and says, of course, we know that this story, like, who touched me? And of course, the irony is not lost on any of us, that if Jesus could just do this for me, if I could just get this done, if I could just get this done, if I could just have my bleeding stopped, whatever the bleeding is. And then the text reads, when she realized that she could not remain hidden, And of course, this is this process of healing, right? I have my imagination has a sense of what healing is going to look like. And what I don't recognize is that once we get the bleeding stopped, there's still a lot that remains hidden. And Jesus isn't content with just stopping the hemorrhaging. And of course, you know, he doesn't just keep going and keep in his mind, I'm going to go back and check on that lady later. We'll have a private conversation. No. He calls her out in public. And, you know, a woman like this who's had this kind of a bleeding problem for so many long, I mean, there's all kinds of ways that we can imagine her level of shame, not just for herself personally, but in the context of her community. And he's going to bring this into the public light and saying to her, your faith has made you well. And it's not just about your bleeding. And so this notion of imagining something beyond who we are that has been itself so shattered requires the presence of others who can come for us. The notion of character and the notion of the story, like if we can imagine the story that she's telling, of all the story that she tells, all I need to do is just touch his hem of his garment and I'll just go. I'll just go home peaceably. That's the limit of of the story that she's telling. And her character is still fraught with shame. It's still fraught with that. But Jesus, not being content, comes for the whole kit and caboodle. You know, one of the things about great literature, when you read Dostoevsky, when you read, when you read Wendell Berry, you know, right? The characters are all like real people. Like they are beautiful people and they are people who are so screwed up. And this is me. This is me and you, right? These are authors who know that God works with real people. He doesn't work with plastic people. And Jesus was working with a real woman who had a real desire, and not even she knew what the desire was pointing to. She thought the desire had its limit at just get the bleeding stopped. And he had so much greater desire for her and for her desire itself to expand. Take the demoniac in Mark 5. I'm reading this just in the last few months, and I read this for the first time. I was stunned. In Mark, right? It's the word beg happens like a dozen times. Right. He begged him, like all these begging going on. The villagers begging Jesus to leave after he sends the demons into the pigs. Begging. Mm-hmm. And after they begged Jesus to leave, the demoniac, having been healed, begged Jesus that he may be with him. And I'm like, man, what a great story. And Mark's gospel reads, but Jesus refused. He didn't just say, but Jesus said to him, I have an even better plan for you. No, he refused because there's a sense in which Jesus had an even greater desire that this guy couldn't see. He sees that this guy's mission back to his own family and his own town is a desire that this guy hasn't yet imagined. This guy wants to be with Jesus, but even Jesus knows that just being with me is not big enough. I want you to imagine that I'm going to go with you and you're going to tell people and I'm going to be with you. And you see where this goes. I want you to create beauty and goodness in the world in ways that your imagination can't yet fathom, because you're a complex person and you got all these broken things. And you think that like, well, one minute your character's okay and your story's not. Next minute your story's not, okay and your character's not. And I want you to know that the more that you practice allowing me to be in each of these rooms of your house, where all the beauty and all the mess exists together, we're going to take the mess And because we are going to be together and you're going to be with community, it is in that process of being gazed upon that my character is formed and that my story is transformed. These two things are always running symphonically, right? My character and my story. And one becomes the resource for the other that turns back around and resources the first. And the more we are practicing being in a space with others in which this ongoing practice continues, at some point, our character and our story becomes indistinguishable from one another.
Amen. That's that integration you like talking about, isn't it?
Yeah.
Curt, what I'm interested to hear how this has played out in your own life of the difference, and maybe there isn't a difference, but the difference between asking yourself these questions versus putting yourself in a space to hear Jesus ask you these questions. So you've pointed this out in your book, you point this out, that Jesus's primary teaching style amongst people and his disciples is asking questions. And Jesus's single greatest utterance in the New Testament in his life was, "What do you want?" It's the question he asked more than any other question. So there is a sense, because we played this out earlier, like there is a sense where it's like, I want a Tesla. Well, it's like, well, why do you want a Tesla? It's like, cool, because I want to be seen as cool. It's like, well, why? Because it's like, well, I want to be affirmed, and they're like, and it gets better and better as you go back. You're like, okay, this is actually becoming very noble, where it started very, very selfish. And then there are other situations where, so Jesus does this with Peter. At the beginning, when he meets him, he extends an invitation to come and follow him, right? Come follow me. And then at the end of John, like after all the betrayal that he extends the invitation again to him, right? Like it seems categorically different, but it's the exact same words. So sometimes just hearing it from Jesus makes all the difference, right? It's just, it's really important to like put yourself in a position to stare at a picture for 30 minutes or whatever, so that the noise dies down, so that you can start to hear the still small one. So I was just wondering how it's worked in your own life of learning to ask yourself, because there are times when I've needed to hear it from Jesus, but I've practiced it myself, and it just becomes this infinite regress of why, and looking at my own motives, where Jesus is like, no, like just stop, be still, breathe, But then the other way, it's worked the exact same way the other way as well, where Jesus is like, hey, buddy, I need you around people, like I don't just want you in isolation. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, Shane, one of the things that we talk about, I talk about with folks, is just the nature of how we've been made, and that we are made as rhythmic people. And that rhythm begins with the cosmos, right? With the circulation of the planets, spinning of the earth, the movement of the tides. And we get to the human gait, pulmonary rhythm, cardiac rhythm. Like there is a systole, a diastole. And in the same way, relationally, right? It begins with labor when a baby is coming into the world. The first contraction, the baby moves out, the baby comes back, the baby moves out, the baby comes back. And at some point they go off to work or college, right? They really go out.
Yeah.
But sometimes they come back. And they're still coming and going. And then they go off and they get married, but they come back and they visit. All these, that we are this movement. And this represents this notion that we are people who flourish as rhythmic people that move between solitude and community, not isolation, but solitude, right? This sense of, for God alone, my soul waits in silence, Psalm 62. And in that space, I want to hear God speak. And I go out from there, and then I hear God speak in the context of community. And in the context of community, the community and I also speak back to God, right? This is Eugene Peterson's lovely little book on the Psalms, answering God, answering him. And then I move back into solitude, and so forth and so on. But it's very difficult for me to have a sense of God's voice if I don't have something first outside of me in some kind of connection of community to give me that sense to begin with. Lots of people read the scriptures and have very different takes on who the God is of the Bible that they're reading. A lot of people know about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and don't want to have anything to do with Christians or the God of the Bible because of Christians or because of what they've heard or read or whatever. And so this notion of hearing God's voice, hearing Jesus say to me, and not just Curt doing his own internal examination, but Jesus say to me, requires that I'm in community enough to hear other people's voice mimic that. Other people's voice encourage me to imagine Jesus' voice. I was at a so I was mentioning earlier my friend Anne Halley, who's the spiritual mother to me, has become. I hear the voice of God when she talks to me. And that makes it possible for me then, when I am in my own place of solitude, to imagine Anne introducing me to the Jesus that she talks about. And I can hear that Jesus say things to me that I otherwise couldn't imagine him saying if it weren't for Anne. And so in many ways, this God's image bearers, it just never stops. That I can imagine hearing Jesus in the privacy of my morning time of prayer and reflection and scripture reading. I hear the voice of Jesus. And tomorrow, I'll see him and he'll point and I'll look and there you will be, Shane, in the room. And he'll say, like, this is me. And because you're in the room with me, I'm much more likely to pay attention to Jesus. And the thing about this is that God, our Trinitarian God, like, he's not insecure. He's not worried about like not getting enough credit for things. Jesus isn't worried about having to share the stage with other people. This is the thing. When you come upon beauty, beauty itself makes no apology for itself, nor does it have to proclaim itself. It just is. The sunrise doesn't come with somebody else that comes to announce that it's coming because somehow it's too insecure on its own. Worried that like you might like not think that it's beautiful enough. It doesn't have to proclaim its own self. It just is. That is who God is transforming us into becoming. People who don't have to proclaim that we are who we are, because our just simply being in the room will be enough for us and for everybody else. But as we say, there is no such thing as self-identification all by itself. There's no such thing. How do you self-identify? Like, it's the wrong question. The question is, who are the people in your life who are telling you the truth about who you are? It doesn't mean that I have no agency. It doesn't mean that I have no role in this. It doesn't mean that I'm not going to live into it. I'm going to have to choose to live into the identity that is given to me. The question is, who is it from whom I'm receiving it? Because it's not good for man to be alone. And God made us this way in order for us to be able to be drawn to each other because of our desire. When the writer of the Ecclesiastes says, and he has put eternity in their hearts. This is not just a comment about time. It's a comment about depth of desire. You know, the whole notion of the Big Bang theory, right, is this idea that all the mass of the cosmos at one time was held within an object that, you know, I don't know, is smaller than the dot of a period at the end of a page, which of course is, you know, beyond imagination. I think that's part of the point. And if you think about that, that has been placed in our hearts, that kind of depth for longing. And that longing is only ever going to expand. And here's the good news, that God is ready to meet the challenge. That when we come hungering and thirsting, he's going to bring the water and the food. And then when we get hungrier, he's going to bring even more. And the feast only gets bigger and our appetites grow, but not for consumption, not for devouring, but for desire. And for becoming love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, becoming outposts of beauty and goodness in the world.
That's as beautiful a place to end as any. And I just like you a lot, Curt.
Oh, you're so kind to me. Goodness.
No, that's.
Thank you. Right back at you. This is such. So it's. I mean, I wish we had other word like I wish I had I wish I had a more elegant word than fun.
Yeah, sure,
I wish I had a more elegant word than fun. But let's just imagine whatever that elegant language is for fun.
Yeah,
let's just say that's what this has been.
Amen. I the last interview we did together, I think it was in the very intro when I asked, "How are you?" During we started recording. I said, "So Curt, how are you?" And you shed some things, and then you stopped and said, "But his mercies are new every morning." And then you started to cry, and then I started to cry, and we didn't even get past the intro. But today we got like 10 minutes in before we both started leaking. So I am grateful for that. But Curt, we always end with two questions. One, how can people be tracking with you? So you can tell us about your book, your website. And then how can we be praying for you?
Yeah. Thank you. Tracking. So there are a number of ways you can follow me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. I have accounts there. And I'm just so grateful. Since we've last talked in January, I actually hired a social media director. Her name's Kara, and she just blows my mind. And I can sing her praises. She's just been such a joy to have it. So those three, and then I have a website, CurtThompsonMD.com, that there are offerings there, there are articles there. You can track my speaking schedule and so forth. The other thing that I'm just really excited about is that beginning in March of 2021, we launched a podcast. It's the Being Known podcast, and we are now in the third. I think this coming week will be the third episode of the third season.
Nice.
So we've 2 seasons are down, and the third season is on the way. And we're gonna wrap up recording of that by the end of the year, and then begin a 4th season of recording. And so Pepper Sweeney, a friend of mine, and I have been having conversations about all these things that we're talking about. And this particular season is committed to unpacking the book, The Soul of Desire. So we're taking 10 episodes to unpack that chapter by chapter, which has been a lot of fun. So that's been another way. You can find that on either iTunes or Spotify. Wherever you get your downloads, your podcast from. So those are some ways to follow me, and praying for me. Shane, I'd say 2 things. One is I am. It's been a busy season, and it's a beautiful season, and it's a busy season. And as I said when we were talking beforehand, when I'm busy, I get anxious because I worry about what's fallen through the cracks and who am I going to disappoint? Right. I told people after a while, as a physician, you get to the point where you're no longer wondering, will I disappoint somebody today? You're like, oh, I wonder who it's going to be today that's going to be upset with me because I'm not following, take a number. Right. I mean, I hate the feeling of disappointment. I hate disappointing people. I hate that part of me that feels like I am a disappointment. So I think this notion of prayer for that I don't give into the temptation of going down that rabbit hole of where anxiety takes me, of being unwantable because I'm not doing everything perfectly. with this gift that God has given me to steward. And I think then the second thing about prayer is I have in the last 6 weeks, 2 months, spent more time than ever before with my 4 and 10 and 13 and 15 and 17-year-old selves, if you will, in ways that I never have before. And part of that is kind of coming to this realization over the last, couple of years of like, my goodness, I don't give myself a break. Like I have been like silently, even without words, like basically in some way, shape, or form, sending the message to all those parts of me that made choices when I did or couldn't figure things out. I'm just really a harsh taskmaster. Like, why didn't you do this? Why did you do that? Like you should have known better. You could have known better. You could have. I'm not even using words, right? I'm so good at my self-condemnation. I don't need words. It's just, I'm so efficient.
Yeah.
And it's like, I'm suddenly discovering that there has been this 4 and 10-year-old that I've been really mean to.
Yeah. For
the better part of 50 years. And like, it's finally like Jesus is stepping in between and saying like, when are you going to give that boy a break? And spending time with him is making a difference. And so I would welcome prayer for that process of healing and recommissioning of those parts of me that have been under the weight of a pretty harsh taskmaster, that they would find their way home.
Amen, buddy. Amen, Curt. Yeah, thank you for, again, not just sharing your discovery with words, but also with tears. It has been a representation of beauty, and we are grateful for you. And I think your prayer request challenges all of us in really wholesome ways. So thank you for that transparency. How the light breeds light. Thank you. And thanks for being with us, Curt. Thanks for being a friend to me and to the Naked Gospel.
Right on. More power to you. Thanks be to God, Shane, for your work. And just so grateful to be with you, and confident in how the Spirit is going to use your work and the Naked Gospel's work in the time and space that it occupies. So Amen. Godspeed.
Amen. Thanks, Curt. Oh, folks, thank you for hanging out with us. I have no idea how to recap this conversation. I was trying to plan it out in my head 5 minutes ago and gave up the task, but it's enough to say that we tell the story wrong. We start with original sin and we move forward from there, but it does start with original beauty. It starts with original blessing. That's Genesis 1, and we start in Genesis 3. So just learning to know the story better, learning to tell it rightly and inhabit it, right? It makes all the difference, because Jesus isn't redeeming trash, he's redeeming beauty. And we have to learn to tell the story right. And so many things in this episode that I would encourage you to practice with the people around you and with your own soul. I'm not going to rehearse them. I couldn't. But there are things that I will be practicing, and I'm looking forward to that. If this podcast was, if you benefited from it, if you thought it was good, share it with somebody else you think would likewise benefit from it. We're grateful for all of you. Thank you for hanging with us, and we will catch you next time on The Naked Gospel.